We noticed there was some pretty awful noise in the output. You could occasionally tune a station, but in general, it just gave you crackling, popping, and just awfulness. And I wasn't really sure where this was coming from at the start of things. I thought, okay, maybe there could be internal arcing in a resistor. That can happen. Maybe there's a high voltage connection that's too close to ground and it's arcing between there. But when I had the set flipped up on its side and my lights were off, I looked underneath and I noticed a whole bunch of arcing coming from the inside of the intermediate frequency can down there at the bottom. This guy. And it occurred to me that there was a good chance that this might have what's called a silver migration disease. The capacitors, the IF cans contain, it's a transformer, but it's two tuned circuits, two tank circuits, an LC type on either side. And the capacitors, as far as I know, were made out of silver. That's really about all I know about it. And over time, they can get, basically, they tarnish. And it can cause arcing or something to that effect. It's creating shorts, but the capacitors inside here are basically toast. They're no good, and they need to be replaced. So we've got to crack this thing open, and I'm going to have to figure out how big they are, ideally by taking it back to college with me and testing it in the lab on an LCR meter to see what it is, and then replacing that with brand new silver mica type connected to the bottom of the terminals. I've already popped it out of there. Now, unlike the earlier style, which are just held together with screws, this has actually got some little metal tabs on it holding the innards to that, and it's a single tuning slug. In this case, you're not actually tuning the capacitors to set the resonance, the peak. You're actually tuning it with the ferrite slug, which I prefer the capacitor method because the slugs, if you use too much force on them or they're too stuck, the ferrite slug is usually just like powdered metal that's been compressed and heated together to solidify. I think it's sintering or something like that. And if that stuff breaks, it's, the IF can is worthless. So these appear to be pretty easy to bend back here. And I'm just gonna crack it open to take a look inside and see what there is. I've never actually popped one of these open before because I've never run into this issue before. Heard plenty about it though. Let's try and wiggle this assembly out. And yeah, okay, this is exactly what it looked like online. So we have our transformer there. Oh, that's not in frame. There we go. So we have our transformer here. We've got two coils, one above the other. I believe they should be about the same winding ratio, so it's a 1-to-1. This is just to act as a filter. And then at the bottom here is where our capacitors are, one for each side. And it's basically just a little sandwich of the sort. And I guess the trick is going to be somehow getting it apart and yeah, just basically removing the original capacitor and replacing it. So when I figure out how to do that, I will update this with a new video clip.
So my original audio was so bad that I decided to just get rid of all of it and start from scratch. So my original plan was to gut the capacitors from this thing, which they're actually two pieces of foil with a piece of mica in between them, and they're clamped in place with a piece of plastic with a rivet. Now I'm yanking the rivet out here because I drilled it out from the bottom. Started with like a 5/16 bit and then worked down to about a quarter to finish out the last of it. Had to be very careful though, as the magnet wire running to the coils is extremely thin, and actually I managed to remove two of them in the process of trying to measure the capacitors. Measuring the capacitors for value actually proved to be a totally fruitless effort, partly because you got to disconnect the wires on these things in order to actually hook up an LDR meter and test them. So you can see the mica sheet's covered in junk here, and it's actually creating conductive paths between the two pieces, causing them to arc. So it's totally worthless. However, those strips are very good soldering points. In fact, they're part of the terminal, so it's all the same material. So all you have to do really is clip them back a little bit, bend them up, curl them in to create solder points, and then you can insert new capacitors in there and trap them inside the IF can instead of having to put them underneath where they're obvious. Maybe not that big of a deal on something like this, but it does maintain the aesthetic. Now, since I couldn't really measure the proper value of things, what I wound up deciding to do is to just hook this thing up to the oscilloscope, apply an appropriate signal to it with a signal generator. I have a tube RF signal generator, not a superbly accurate one as I had discovered, but once I hooked that up, I would see where the can would peak more or less, and then I could simply swap in capacitors until I got an appropriate response. So here I've got the oscilloscope and signal gen hooked up to our IF can. This is after I repaired the two damaged magnet wires I managed to disconnect. And I've discovered my signal gen isn't supremely accurate. In fact, accuracy seems to change between the various bands that you select. So for this, I just cranked the RF attenuation as high as it would go so we could get a noticeable signal on the oscilloscope. And I made sure to isolate the two units so they are not sharing a ground in any way, shape, or form, because the power supply in the signal gen is not transformerless, so it would not quite like that as an input on a grounded piece of test equipment. The results of this test simply show that the IF transformer worked. I would later repeat this test with a pair of 100 picofarad 500 volt rated capacitors that I happen to have laying around, and although they did not peak at roughly the same point, honestly I think the results speak for themselves.
Okay, so I've got my IF can with the 100 picofarad capacitors in there set up, and I wasn't terribly pleased with the results on my oscilloscope. My my signal generator was giving me mixed signals, and I wanted to get it close to 455 kilohertz, but it didn't seem to want to play ball with me. So I figured, you know what, we'll just stick it back in the radio. So I've got it tied in with wires, jumper leads temporarily, and I decided to say, you know what, let's just turn it on and see what happens. And I kid you not, I turned this thing on and this is what I get.
Direct violation of the Iranian transactions and sanctions regulations, and we will not as a country tolerate efforts to circumvent.
Child, I can't take that away, but what I can do is...
He won a Tony Award in 1992. He died of cancer in 2003. I'm Lisa Lacera. This is Fox News.
Partly sunny this afternoon, 45 to 50. Mostly cloudy for tonight, 25 to 30. Mostly sunny 50 tomorrow, and on Wednesday. Top player in the NBA wanting out. I mean, where's the...
Kind of lonely out here.
And their fans can legitimately hope to contend. It almost feels like college football. You have to have a power. There's a power five in the NBA and a group of five is what it feels like in the league right now. And I don't know what the answer is, because New Orleans certainly had the perfect superstar in Anthony Davis. If you've been around him, you know he.
For those fortunate enough to help the person who has always been their hero, find the care guides you need to help at aarp.org/caregiving. Brought to you by AARP.
So yeah, my temporary rig with the 100 picos apparently worked just fine. So I'll get those tucked in there, connect them up permanently, and then we'll go ahead and stick this guy back in the chassis and retest to make sure that it wasn't just a fluke. I'm hoping that it wasn't. This is very, very lucky. I've never actually rebuilt an IF can before, so if this thing goes smoothly, I'll have this little guy up and running, and it'll give me a reason to build a quick AM transmitter so I can start doing some test broadcasts. Alright, here we go, moment of truth. Got the IF transformer back installed. I haven't actually tested it yet, so this could be a total failure. Yeah, it's inspiring, right? That's not power. That's power. Oh, look at that.
If anyone in your family has type 2 diabetes. Another if you've got high blood pressure. If you're overweight, raise another finger. 2 if you're very overweight. And 3 if you're really overweight. You've just taken the world's first audio pre-diabetes test. And if you're holding up 5 or more fingers, visit doihaveprediabetes.org or talk to your doctor.
Now there are some tears in the speaker I still got to take care of, but I managed to get the frame glued back in place so that the cone is relatively equal at all the edges on the circumference.
Come to Dynavite.
Or edge, I guess.
Order a 90-day supply of Dynavite. Dynavite is nutrition.
Yeah, I'd say next on the list is fixing this chunk missing out of the cabinet here with JB Weld, and then stripping and repainting it. This particular one has the ivory paint code, and I still need to do something with the damage to the dial scale mount. I don't know how they screwed that up, but they did, and we'll have to correct that. That's all for now.